Hey everybody, welcome back to Run and Gun. I'm JT and we are here in Adobe Lightroom Classic for a Dark and Moody Portrait tutorial. Thank you guys to your response to all of my other Dark and Moody tutorials, and I think a portrait tutorial is overdue because sometimes skin tones can get a little crazy when you start playing with these dark and moody looks. As you can see here, this is the final image we created, and I'm going to show you guys the before image. This is before we did anything to it. As you can see, there is a dramatic difference. So let's hop right into this dark and moody tutorial and see how we created this final shot. So first of all, I want to show you guys a little trick. If you go up to the upper right hand corner over here, you can see this says Calibration, and you'll notice Calibration is on top of Basic. What I did is I reorganized my panels over here, and you can do that by right-clicking, hitting Customize Develop Panel, and you can reorder all of your develop panels. So what I did is I wanted to put calibration on top so I can make any sort of color calibration adjustments to my images before I even get started toning. You guys can organize this however you like. You don't have to do it this way, but it's just the way I prefer to organize my development panels, and it's just how I like to work. So we'll go ahead, we will save that. And we're going to start here with our calibration panel. Now I recommend moving it up to the top, but that is completely up to you guys. So let's start with our calibration here, and I'm going to move our shadows just a hint towards the purple. They were feeling very green over here. And I'm going to start playing with our reds. Move our reds a little bit towards the orange. Now you'll see why I do that here in a minute, because I'm also going to start moving my greens kind of towards the bluish here. Somewhere in the 60s looks good. I'm going to turn down that saturation for my greens a touch in that dark and moody look. And then I'm going to turn my blue hue down a touch, around 50. That looks good. Now you can see what I was talking about just a second ago with my reds. I'm bringing some of those skin tones back towards a more natural color. Turn those down. Also may turn down the saturation of the skin tones just a touch. You got to be very careful with playing with those skin tones. We can take a look at the before and the after. We darkened up our greens a little bit, desaturated our greens, and we're already on our way towards that moody look. So let's go ahead, let's close our calibration tab here. And all of those settings are going to be just a little bit different. You're going to have to eyeball them for your image. Again, not to mess up your skin tones. Now we are in our basic development panel here. I'm going to start by using the Adobe Portrait profile. You can see that just flattens out the image, and I think it gives much more pleasing skin tones. Now this image is feeling a little bit warm, so for that dark and moody look, we're going to turn down our temperature a hint here, closer to 4,000 instead of 5,000. That looks pretty good. And our tint looks good. Now I'm going to turn down our exposure. Again, dark and moody. Want to darken up these bits of our image. That looks pretty good. We're going to go ahead with masks, and we're going to bring up the exposure on our face later, so don't worry about that right now. We're going to turn up our contrast a hint, somewhere in the 20-ish to 30 range. That's looking pretty good. We're going to turn down our highlights. Again, we will play with those a little bit later with some masking. Turn down those highlights, turn up our shadows to get a little more detail back in our shadows. That looks pretty good. Don't over crank it, but bring it up quite a bit. And we'll make those highlights pop just a touch. You can see I'm making those skin tones pop a touch by bringing up our whites, and we will bring down our black values a hint. So we are already getting a pretty moody look here. I like the way it's going. If we take a look at where we started and where we are now, I think that is looking pretty great so far. So let's go ahead and play with our presence sliders. I'm going to turn down texture a bit. It made our skin so much softer than it was before. Kind of a high frequency separation type feel. I'm going to go ahead and actually do some high frequency separation on this image for our final image, and I will cover that in a different tutorial. But for now, our texture slider and bringing that into the negative values will give you kind of that high frequency separation retouched look. I'm going to add just a very small hint of clarity, very small, just to kind of bring those highlights out again. And then for our dehaze, about -5 to 10. You can see that just gives us kind of like a little airy look. If we would turn up our dehaze, it kind of crunches our shadows, and I don't really want to do that right now. So let's turn that down a bit. It gives us kind of a foggy look. And I think, again, this is looking pretty good so far. I'll bring up our vibrance and bring down our saturation. So again, we are really getting that dark and moody look. We can take a look at the before and where we are now. I like where we're headed, so let's go down to our tone curve next, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to add a bit of contrast and create the quintessential dark and moody look, and this is a huge part of it. So I'm going to click, drag down in our shadows, and then we are going to lift our shadows. That's a huge part of it. And same thing here. I'm going to bring down our highlights a touch, and then bring up the contrast in this image, and I really like where this is going so far. So play with your shadows, play with how much you want to lift your shadows and how much detail here you want to lose in your shadows and how much you want to lift them. You can see right here in the darkest parts of my image, or over here is what I'm affecting with the very end of this slider. So there's a lot of cool things you can do there. I prefer just a subtle matte look, and I can do the very same thing on the far end with my whites and my highlights, kind of playing with that contrast and that matte flatness. I want just enough contrast to make it look realistic and just enough matte for that kind of moody look. So turn on and off our curves, and you can see that really brought us closer to that dark and moody look. So go ahead, close our tone curves, and as you saw in some of my other dark and moody tutorials, we played with the hue, the saturation, and the luminance. And one of my favorite parts of the HSL tab is this targeted adjustment tool where I can click and drag and change hues. So I can turn those greens to blue, and I can do all sorts of cool things, or I can just go ahead and slide them around here. So I might make these greens just a little more blue. I like how that looks. Again, we don't want to play with the skin tones, but if you think that your calibration didn't get you exactly where you wanted to go, you can always do that here with your HSL. And again, be careful with skin tones. So I'll go ahead and I'll reset my skin tones because I like the way they look, but just know you can come back here and play with those. And I'm going to turn the green saturation, the blue saturation down a touch. But she does have some pretty blue eyes, so I will bring up that blue saturation a little bit. That looks good. And then luminance, I'll bring up the blue, I'll bring up our aqua teal color here, and I'll bring up the green. Maybe a little yellow and orange and red for the skin tones. So again, we are looking very dark and moody. I love the way this is looking so far. So as you can see, the face is a little darker than I want it to be. So let's go ahead, let's close our HSL tab, and let's go up to our masking button here on the upper right. Give that a click, and you can do a couple things here. You can select your subject and let Adobe Lightroom automatically select a subject, a sky, a background, but in this instance, the face is pretty much kind of a circle oval here in the image. So I'm going to go ahead, hit radial gradient, and I'm going to click and drag, and we're going to make this match our face the best we can. There we go, that's looking pretty good. And now we have our first mask for our face. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn up my exposure on my face by just about, I think a stop looks pretty good. Maybe turn down the contrast a touch. Turn down my highlights quite a bit. Let's turn up that exposure a hair. That looks good. Turn up my shadows a bit. Maybe turn up the whites. It's looking pretty good. Leave the blacks alone. I think that looks good. And I'm going to warm this up just a couple of degrees. I think 10 looks good. And it's looking a little bit greenish, I think. So I'm going to add some magenta. There we go. That's looking much better. Again, I'm just going to play around with my exposure. There we go. I'm going to play around with this mask a little bit, bring it a little bit wider here. So we have a pretty good feather on here. I think that looks pretty darn good. I think this is looking pretty good so far. Let's turn that mask off and then back on. You can see the huge difference that our mask is making. Go ahead and edit our mask again by clicking up in our little mask box up here with our mask layers. And that looks pretty great. The only thing I'm going to do now, I think, is add 2 more little masks for the eyes. So we'll hit this mask button again in case you lose it. And to create a new mask, I can just hit this little plus button up here in the upper right. I'm going to create 2 more radial gradients and click and drag. And I'll bring my exposure up for the eyes just a touch. That looks pretty good. And I'm going to create another radial gradient by hitting this plus button because I want to save all of my values and I want to duplicate my values in another mask. So I'm not going to create a new layer. I'm going to create a new radial gradient within this mask. So I'll click, drag that new radial gradient, and you can see I have 2 eyes here, 2 radial gradients, and both of these masks respond to the same sliders within mask 2. So we have mask 1 here. You can see mask 1, and I can play with mask 1, and I have mask 2 right here. You can see mask 2, and that is our eyeballs. Be very careful with the eyes. You don't want them to be bleach white. We're going to play with those a little bit, bring up the shadows, make those eyes pop, and I think that looks awesome so far. I'm going to hit enter or return on the keyboard and close out our masks, and I think that looks really good. Let's go ahead and look at the before again. There is the before, and here is the after of our dark and moody portrait. Now there are 2 last things I want to do to this portrait. That is, of course, sharpen. Let's sharpen this portrait, make sure our eyes are nice and tack sharp, turn up that sharpening, turn up the detail a touch. And I don't see much noise in this image at all. I believe, yes, we shot at ISO 100 on an 85mm lens, f2, so there's really almost no noise. I don't really think I need to do any noise reduction, but I will also go down to my effects and our vignetting, and I'm going to give us a little more of a vignette. You can just see that makes the center of the face pop out a little bit more. Feather it, bring in our midpoint, and here you can see with the vignette off, vignette on, just very subtle. And I think that looks great for our dark and moody portrait in Lightroom. Now, to finish up this image before I go and publish it and put it in my portfolio, I am going to do a little high frequency separation, and I will cover that in a future tutorial, so keep an eye out for that. But thank you guys for joining me for this dark and moody portrait tutorial. I hope you guys learned something. If you did, be sure to give a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And as always, be sure to turn on your notification bell so you're seeing all of my new videos. And until next time, get out and go shoot.